This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G. K. Chesterton. Section 13, Chapters 37 through 39. The High Plains. By high plains I do not mean tablelands. Tablelands do not interest one very much. They seem to involve the bore of a climb without the pleasure of a peak. Also they are vaguely associated with Asia and those enormous armies that eat up everything like locusts, as did the army of Xerxes, with emperors from nowhere spreading their battalions everywhere, with the white elephants and the painted horses, the dark engines and the dreadful mounted bowmen of the moving empires of the East, with all that evil insolence, in short, that rolled into Europe in the youth of Nero, and after having been battered about and abandoned by one Christian nation after another, turned up in England with Disraeli, and was christened, or rather paganed, Imperialism. Also, it may be necessary to explain, I do not mean high plains, such as the Theosophists and the higher thought centres talk about. They spell theirs differently, but I will not have theirs in any spelling. They, I know, are always expounding how this or that person is on a lower plane, while they, the speakers, are on a higher plane. Sometimes they will almost tell you what plane, as in 5994 or plane F subplane 304. I do not mean this sort of height either. My religion says nothing about such planes, except that all men are on one plane, and that by no means a higher one. There are saints indeed in my religion, but a saint only means a man who really knows he is a sinner. Why, then, should I talk of the plains as high? I do it for a rather singular reason, which I will illustrate by a parallel. When I was at school, learning all the Greek I have ever forgotten, I was puzzled by the phrase oinon milon, that is, black wine, which continually occurred. I asked what it meant, and many most interesting and convincing answers were given. It was pointed out that we know little of the actual liquid drunk by the Greeks, that the analogy of modern Greek wines may suggest that it was dark and sticky, perhaps a sort of syrup always taken with water, that archaic language about colour is always a little dubious, as where Homer speaks of the wine dark sea, and so on. I was very properly satisfied, and never thought of the matter again until one day, having a decanter of claret in front of me, I happened to look at it. I then perceived that they called wine black because it is black. Very thin, diluted, or held up abruptly against a flame, red wine is red. But seen in body, in most normal shades and semi-lights, red wine is black, and therefore was called so. On the same principles I call the plains high, because the plains always are high. They are always as high as we are. We talk of climbing mountain crest and looking down at the plain, but the phrase is an illusion of our arrogance. It is impossible even to look down at the plain, for the plain itself rises as we rise. It is not merely true that the higher we climb, the wider and wider is spread out below us the wealth of the world. It is not merely that Devil or some other respectable guide for tourists takes us to the top of an exceedingly high mountain and shows us all the kingdoms of the earth. It is more than that in our real feeling of it. It is that, in a sense, the whole world rises with us, roaring, and accompanies us to the crest, like some clanging chorus of eagles. The plains rise higher and higher, like swift grey walls piled up against invisible invaders, and however high a peak you climb, the plain is still as high as the peak. The mountain tops are only noble because from them we are privileged to behold the plains. So the only value in any man being superior is that he may have a superior admiration for the level and the common. If there is any profit in a place craggy and precipitous, it is only because from the vale it is not so easy to see all the beauty of the vale; because when actually in the flats one cannot see their sublime and satisfying flatness. If there is any value in being educated or eminent, which is doubtful enough, it is only because the best instructed man may feel most swiftly and certainly the splendour of the ignorant and the simple, the full magnificence of that mighty human army in the plains. The general goes up to the hill to look at his soldiers, not to look down at his soldiers. He withdraws himself, not because his regiment is too small to be touched, but because it is too mighty to be seen. The chief climbs with submission or goes higher with great humility, since, in order to take a bird's eye view of everything, he must become small and distant like a bird. The most marvellous of those mystical cavaliers who wrote intricate and exquisite verse in England in the 17th century, I mean Henry Vaughan, put the matter in one line, intrinsically immortal and practically forgotten: "O holy hope and high humility." That adjective "high" is not only one of the sudden and stunning inspirations of literature, it is also one of the greatest and gravest definitions of moral science. However far aloft a man may go, he is still looking up, not only at God, which is obvious, but in a manner at men also, seeing more and more all that is towering and mysterious in the dignity and destiny of the lonely house of Adam. I wrote some part of these rambling remarks on a high ridge of rock and turf overlooking a stretch of the central counties. The rise was slight enough in reality, but the immediate ascent had been so steep and sudden that one could not avoid the fancy that on reaching the summit one would look down at the stars. But one did not look down at the stars, but rather up at the cities, seeing as high in heaven the palace town of Alfred like a lit sunset cloud, and away in the void spaces, like a planet in eclipse, Salisbury. So it may be hoped, until we die you and I will always look up rather than down at the labours and the habitations of our race. We will lift up our eyes to the valleys from whence cometh our help. For from every special eminence and beyond every sublime landmark it is good for our souls to see only vaster and vaster visions of that dizzy and divine level, and to behold from our crumbling turrets the tall plains of equality. The Chorus. One of the most marked instances of the decline of true popular sympathy is the gradual disappearance in our time of the habit of singing in chorus. Even when it is done nowadays, it is done tentatively and sometimes inaudibly, apparently upon some preposterous principle which I have never clearly grasped, that singing is an art. In the new aristocracy of the drawing-room a lady is actually asked whether she sings. In the old democracy of the dinner-table a man was simply told to sing, and he had to do it. I like the atmosphere of those old banquets. I like to think of my ancestors, middle-aged or venerable gentlemen, all sitting round the table and explaining that they would never forget old days or friends, with a rumpty-iddity-iddy, or letting it be known that they would die for England's glory with their tooral, etc. Even the vices of that society, which sometimes, I fear, rendered the narrative portions of the song almost as cryptic and inarticulate as the chorus, were displayed with a more human softening than the same vices in the saloon bars of our own time. I greatly prefer Mr. Richard Swiveller to Mr. Stanley Ortheris. I prefer the man who exceeded in rosy wine in order that the wing of friendship might never moult a feather, to the man who exceeds quite as much in whiskies and sodas, but declares all the time that he's for number one, and that you don't catch him paying for other men's drinks. The old men of pleasure, with their tooral, at least got some social and communal virtue out of pleasure. The new men of pleasure, without the slightest vestige of a tooral, are simply hermits of irreligion instead of religion, anchorites of atheism, and they might as well be drugging themselves with hashish or opium.